I didn't plan on talking to anyone that morning. The coffee shop was just a pause in my day, a small square of time between errands and obligations, a place where I could sit quietly and let the world move without asking anything from me. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped in, carrying with it the familiar scent of roasted beans and warm milk. It felt comforting in a way I couldn't explain, like returning to a place that didn't need me to be anything more than present. I ordered my usual, black coffee, no sugar, and waited as the barista called my name. The shop was half full, dotted with laptops, notebooks, and people staring into cups as if answers might surface in the foam. I chose a small table by the window, my favorite one, where the light spilled in gently, and the street outside became a moving painting of strangers passing by. I had just taken my first sip when someone cleared their throat near my table. "Sorry," a voice said. "Is this seat taken?" I looked up, surprised. A person stood there holding a cup and gesturing to the empty chair across from me. There was nothing remarkable about them at first glance. Simple clothes, tired eyes, a polite half smile. But something about the way they asked made it hard to say no. "No," I replied. "Go ahead." They sat down with a quiet thank you, placing their cup carefully on the table as if it mattered where it rested. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I returned my gaze to the window, assuming that would be the end of it. Just two strangers sharing a table in silence. But then they said, "Do you ever notice how people walk faster when they're alone?" I blinked and looked back at them. Outside, a man hurried past, phone pressed to his ear, eyes fixed forward. I smiled despite myself. "I guess I never paid attention," I said. "But now that you mention it, yeah, it's like they're racing something. Or running from it," they added softly. That was the moment the conversation began, not with names or polite questions, but with an observation that felt oddly personal. We talked about the street, about how mornings felt different from afternoons, about how coffee tasted better when you didn't rush it. The words came easily, as if they'd been waiting for a reason to exist. I found myself laughing at something they said, surprised by the sound of it. It had been a while since laughter came without effort. They noticed, too, because they paused and smiled, not in a proud way, but in a gentle one, like they were glad to have contributed something small and good to my day. "I'm glad I sat here," they said. "So am I," I replied, and I realized I meant it. I didn't know then that this simple conversation, born from an empty chair and a passing thought, would stay with me long after the coffee cooled. At that moment, it was just two people talking in a quiet shop, unaware that something had already shifted, subtly and irreversibly between sips of coffee and passing strangers outside the window. After the first laugh faded, silence settled again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't awkward or heavy. It was comfortable, like a pause in music that made the next note more meaningful. I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the dark surface ripple, while they traced circles on the rim of their cup with one finger. "I come here a lot," they said eventually. "Usually to think, or avoid thinking. Depends on the day." I nodded. "Same. It's easier to sit with your thoughts when there's noise around. Makes them feel less loud." They looked at me with mild surprise, as if I'd said something they hadn't expected but needed to hear. That look lingered for a second too long, and suddenly I became aware of myself, how I was sitting, how much of my life was unintentionally leaking into this conversation. For a while, we talked about harmless things, the weather that couldn't decide what it wanted to be, the playlist humming through the speakers, the way the barista remembered regulars' orders without writing them down. None of it was important, yet all of it felt necessary, like we were slowly testing the edges of something fragile. I realized then that we still hadn't exchanged names. It felt strange, noticing that. Normally, names come first, like a label slapped onto a box before you decide what's inside. But here we were, already unpacking small truths without that formality. I started, then stopped. They raised an eyebrow, amused. "You don't have to, you know." "I know," I said. "It just feels odd not to." They considered that, then nodded. All right, I'm glad you said something. We shared our names quietly, almost ceremonially, as if saying them too loudly might break whatever ease had formed between us. Hearing my name spoken by a stranger felt unfamiliar, like seeing it written in a different handwriting. When they said it, it sounded softer, more intentional. We went back to talking, but the tone had shifted. Knowing their name made them feel closer, more real. It also made the stakes feel higher, though I couldn't explain why. I caught myself wondering where they came from before sitting down. What kind of life waited for them outside this coffee shop? They asked me what I did, and for once, I didn't give the polished answer. I told them what I loved about it and what tired me out. I admitted things I usually kept vague. They listened, not the polite kind of listening where someone waits for their turn to speak, but the kind where they stayed with my words, as if they mattered. You think a lot, they said. I have to, I replied. If I don't, the thoughts pile up. They smiled. I get that. Outside, the street grew busier. Cups emptied. Time moved, quietly but persistently. I should have checked my phone, should have remembered my schedule, but I didn't want to. For once, I didn't feel pulled elsewhere. It struck me then how rare this was. A conversation without purpose, without an end goal. Just two people sharing a moment because neither rushed to leave it. And somewhere between names almost not shared and truths casually revealed, I felt a small, undeniable shift. Not excitement, not certainty, just the sense that this conversation had weight, that it might follow me home, linger in my thoughts, and quietly ask to be remembered. At some point, the coffee shop refilled itself. New faces replaced the old ones, chairs scraped softly against the floor, and the air grew warmer with the smell of fresh espresso. I noticed it all in fragments, like background noise to something more important unfolding at our table. They were telling me about a place they used to visit as a child, a small bookstore tucked between two buildings, easy to miss unless you were looking for it. As they spoke, their voice changed, growing steadier, almost nostalgic. I could picture it clearly, even though I'd never been there. I think I go looking for places like that now, they said. Quiet ones, spaces where nothing is expected of you. I understood immediately. Somewhere you're allowed to just exist. Exactly. That was when the conversation began to drift into deeper waters, without either of us announcing it. We talked about expectations, those placed on us by others, and the heavier ones we placed on ourselves. They admitted feeling behind in life, like everyone else had received a map they somehow missed. I confessed that I often felt the same, even on days when everything looked fine from the outside. There was a relief in saying it out loud. Not because it fixed anything, but because it was heard. They didn't try to reassure me with empty optimism. They didn't rush to offer solutions. They simply nodded, eyes steady, letting the truth sit between us. That quiet acceptance felt rarer than advice. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The hum of conversation around us filled the gap. I watched a couple at the counter laugh over something trivial, their joy effortless and loud. Do you ever feel, I said slowly, like you're always holding something back? Like there's this version of you that never quite steps forward? They leaned back in their chair, considering the question. All the time, they said. I think everyone has that version. The scary part is deciding when, or if, you let them speak. I hadn't expected that answer, but it stayed with me. I thought about all the things I edited out of myself each day, the thoughts I swallowed, the honesty I postponed for a more convenient moment that never seemed to arrive. I realized then that this conversation worked because neither of us was trying to impress the other. There was no performance, no careful crafting of the right responses, just honesty, uneven and unfinished. They glanced at their watch and sighed. I should probably go soon. The words landed heavier than they should have. I felt a flicker of disappointment, quick and irrational, like a door closing before I'd decided whether to step through. Yeah, I said, pretending it didn't matter. Me too. But neither of us moved. Instead, we sat there for a few more seconds, aware of the limited time but unwilling to be the first to end it. There were things I almost said, questions I nearly asked, but I held them back, unsure if they belonged to this moment or a different one. When they finally stood, I stood too. We exchanged a smile, softer than before, edged with something unspoken. "Thanks for the conversation," they said. "No," I replied, "thank you." As they walked toward the door, I watched them go, feeling oddly lighter and heavier all at once. I didn't know what would happen next, if there would be a next at all, but I knew this. Some conversations don't need to last forever to leave a mark. This one already had. The door closed behind them with a soft chime, and suddenly the coffee shop felt louder. Not louder in sound, but in presence. Every clatter of cups, every burst of laughter, every hiss of the espresso machine seemed to rush forward to fill the space they'd left behind. I sat back down slowly, my coffee now cold, my reflection faintly visible in the dark surface of the cup. I told myself it was just a conversation. A good one, yes, but still something fleeting. People talked every day, shared pieces of themselves, then went back to their lives. That was normal. And yet, my chest felt tight, like I'd misplaced something small but important. I gathered my things, hesitating before standing. Part of me expected them to walk back in, to realize they'd forgotten something, a phone, a notebook, an excuse to return. When that didn't happen, I finally left the table by the window. Outside, the air was cooler. The street looked the same as it had before, but I didn't feel the same moving through it. I replayed fragments of the conversation in my head, not searching for meaning, just revisiting the tone of it, the ease. It struck me how rare it was to feel understood without having to explain everything. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I completed tasks, answered messages, smiled at the right moments, but part of me stayed in that coffee shop, suspended in the quiet between sentences. Every now and then, I wondered if they were thinking about the conversation too, or if it had already faded into the background of their day. That night, lying in bed, the questions I hadn't asked surfaced again. Where were they headed in life? What had shaped the way they spoke, the way they listened? Would we recognize each other again if we crossed paths somewhere else, stripped of that shared table and warm cups? Days passed. I returned to the coffee shop, half expecting, half dreading a familiar face. I chose the same table by the window, ordered the same drink. Each time the door chimed, my attention lifted without permission. Each time, it wasn't them. I tried to laugh at myself for that. It felt foolish to attach significance to a single meeting. And yet, something had changed. I found myself listening more closely to people, asking better questions, allowing pauses instead of rushing to fill them. It was as if that conversation had tuned me to a different frequency. One afternoon, as I packed up to leave, I noticed something carved faintly into the edge of the wooden table. Words, barely visible unless the light hit them just right. "You're allowed to take your time." I traced the letters with my fingertip, a small smile forming. I didn't know who had carved it or when, but it felt like a message left just when I needed it. Maybe that was the real gift of the conversation, not the person themselves, but what they unlocked in me. As I stepped outside, I realized I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for them. Not for a repeat of that exact moment. I was carrying it forward instead, letting it soften the way I moved through the world. Still, somewhere deep down, I knew this story wasn't finished. Not yet. I didn't expect to see them again, not because I didn't want to, but because life rarely circles back so neatly. Moments like that conversation usually live on as memories, self-contained, complete in their briefness. I had made peace with that, or at least convinced myself I had. It was raining the morning it happened, the kind of rain that softened the city, blurring edges and slowing people down. I ducked into the coffee shop out of habit, more than intention. shaking water from my jacket as the bell chimed above me. The smell of coffee wrapped around me instantly, familiar and grounding. I ordered my drink and turned, already scanning for the table by the window. They were sitting there. For a second, I thought my mind was filling in what it wanted to see. But then they looked up, and recognition spread across their face in the same quiet way it did in mine. No shock, no rush, just a shared understanding that this was real. "Hi," they said, standing slightly unsure. "Hi," I replied, smiling before I could stop myself. We laughed then, both of us, at the improbability of it. I sat down, and the space between us felt unchanged, as if no time had passed at all. We didn't talk about the gap, about the days or weeks in between. We talked about what had happened since, what we'd noticed, what had shifted. They told me that conversation had stayed with them too, that it had made them braver in small ways, more honest, more present. Hearing that did something to me. It made the moment complete in a way I hadn't known it needed. Outside, the rain traced patterns down the glass. Inside, time moved gently. Eventually, we exchanged numbers this time, not hurriedly, not as an obligation, but as a natural extension of the moment. There was no promise attached to it, no grand declaration, just openness. When we said goodbye again, it felt different. Not heavier, not lighter, just settled. I knew now that the value of that first conversation hadn't depended on what came after. It had already done its work. As I walked away, coffee warming my hands, I felt calm. Not because I knew where things were headed, but because I didn't need to. Some connections aren't meant to be defined immediately. Some are meant to unfold slowly, or simply remind you of who you are when you're fully present. That simple conversation at the coffee shop hadn't changed my life in dramatic ways. It hadn't rewritten my story. But it had changed the way I listened, the way I spoke, the way I stayed, and somehow that was enough.